I didn't react when she said it. My dog is smarter than you. The words echoed across the glass conference room like someone had slammed a door. Nearly 50 people were sitting around that massive table. Department heads, junior analysts, project managers, interns trying to look important by typing notes on their laptops. And for a moment, nobody spoke. Then the laughter started. Not all at once. First a small chuckle from the far end of the table. Then a louder one from someone behind me. And finally the sound that hit me the hardest, Richard Hale's laugh. Her father. My boss. He leaned back in his leather chair like he had just heard the funniest joke of the month. His shoulders shaking slightly while he shook his head with amusement. All right, he said casually, waving his hand. Let's stay focused. Focused. That word hung in the air like an insult wrapped in politeness. I stood there quietly. On the table in front of me, a plastic water bottle had rolled over when someone knocked it during the laughter. It slowly slid off the edge and landed on the carpet with a soft thud. I bent down, picked it up. Another bottle had fallen too. I grabbed that one as well and placed both back on the table like nothing unusual had happened. No one looked at me. They were already turning back to Lily's presentation like I was just another piece of furniture in the room. And that's when I made my decision. I walked out. No speech. No angry words. No dramatic scene. Just quiet footsteps leaving the room. The door clicked softly behind me, and the company that had depended on me for 11 years continued their meeting. Without realizing they had just unplugged the one person keeping everything running. My name is Elena Carter. For over a decade, I was the invisible backbone of Hale Digital Strategy, one of Chicago's fastest-growing consulting firms. At least that's what the industry magazines like to call it. But inside the company, titles told a very different story. Richard Hale was the visionary CEO. Lily Hale, his daughter, was the brilliant strategist who had modernized the brand. And me? I was the operations manager. Which sounded boring enough that nobody outside the company ever asked what I actually did. But the truth was far more complicated. When I joined Hale Digital at 24 years old, the company had just 12 employees and a tiny rented office above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon every morning. Richard used to call me his problem solver. Back then, it sounded like a compliment. Something breaks, Elena fixes it, he would tell clients proudly. And I did. If a campaign report crashed the night before a presentation, I stayed until 3 in the morning rebuilding it. If a client threatened to cancel their contract, I rewrote the strategy and calmed them down before sunrise. If our systems failed during a launch, I patched them together piece by piece. Over time, those little fixes turned into something bigger. I built internal systems, tracking dashboards, automated analytics, client performance databases. Every year the company grew, and every year the systems I built became more complex. Soon the company had 70 employees, then 90, then over 100. But the strange thing about being the person who fixes everything quietly is that people start assuming things just magically work. No one thinks about the person behind the curtain. Except when something goes wrong. That's when they call you. And I was always there. At midnight. On weekends. Even during vacations. Because somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself loyalty mattered. That if I worked hard enough, one day someone would notice. Then Lily joined the company. She had just finished her MBA and arrived with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. From the moment she stepped into the office, it was obvious the company would eventually belong to her. Richard introduced her during a company meeting like she was the future. My daughter Lily will be helping us lead the next phase of innovation. Everyone clapped politely. I did too. At first she was polite to me. But that didn't last long. The first insult happened during a team meeting about a campaign analytics dashboard I had built. Lily stared at the screen and frowned. This interface is confusing, she said. I raised my hand slightly. I can adjust it if you want. I designed the system. She looked surprised. You did? Yes. She leaned back in her chair, tilting her head. Well, maybe design just isn't your strength. A few people laughed lightly. I forced a smile. That was the beginning. The comments became more frequent after that. Sometimes subtle. Elena's system is a little outdated. sometimes more direct. Do you always explain things this slowly? And occasionally, when she was in a particularly confident mood, well, even my dog could probably figure this out faster. Every time it happened, Richard brushed it off like harmless teasing. Lily has a sharp sense of humor, he would say. Sharp. That was one word for it. But what bothered me most wasn't the jokes. It was the fact that Lily had absolutely no idea how the company actually worked. She gave presentations. She impressed investors. But the entire operational engine behind those presentations, the data systems, the automated reports, the client management tools, the emergency backups, every single piece had been built by me over 11 years. And none of it was documented in a way anyone else could easily understand. Not intentionally. It just happened that way over time. Because whenever I tried to train someone else, Richard would say something like, "Don't worry about it, Elena. You're the expert." So I kept fixing things. Until the day Lily stood in front of 50 employees and compared me to her dog. After leaving the conference room, I went straight to my office, closed the door, and sat down quietly. My computer screen was filled with dashboards monitoring nearly every campaign the company was running. Dozens of clients. Millions of dollars in contracts. Every metric updated through systems I had personally built. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not angry. Not even sad. Just thinking. Because something Lily said kept repeating in my mind. My dog is smarter than you. I smiled slightly. Maybe she believed that. Maybe Richard believed it too. But the truth was much simpler. For 11 years, I had been the one fixing every mistake they didn't even know existed. The quiet safety net under their entire company. And that afternoon, I realized something important. They didn't respect the safety net. So why keep holding them up? I opened my calendar. Then I opened a document that very few people knew existed. A personal log of every system I had ever built for Hale Digital. Not instructions. Just notes. Reminders for myself. Shortcuts. Workarounds. Hidden patches that kept things running smoothly. Without those tiny fixes, the company wouldn't crash immediately. But over time, things would start to break. Slowly. Quietly. Like a clock losing pieces one by one. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. For 11 years I had protected that company from its own mistakes. But the moment Lily compared me to her dog, something changed. Because the real problem wasn't that she insulted me. The real problem was that she had finally convinced me to stop helping. And the moment I stopped fixing things, the countdown to their collapse had already begun. The strange thing about walking away quietly is that most people don't notice right away. When I left the strategy meeting that afternoon, no one came after me. No one knocked on my office door. In fact, the meeting continued for another hour without me, as if the person who had built half the company's operational systems was just another employee, who could be replaced by the next Monday morning. I packed my laptop slowly, closed a few dashboards that were monitoring active campaigns, and sat there for a while thinking about the last 11 years of my life. The late nights, the weekends I gave up, the vacations I canceled because a client dashboard crashed or a reporting system broke 5 minutes before an executive presentation. For years I told myself that loyalty mattered, that dedication would eventually lead to respect. But the truth was sitting in that conference room laughing with Lily. Respect had never been part of their plan. By the time I finally left the building that evening, the Chicago sky was already dark. My phone buzzed once while I was in the elevator, but it wasn't Richard or Lily. It was one of the junior analysts asking if a campaign report had finished processing yet. I stared at the message for a moment, and then slipped the phone into my pocket without answering. That was the first time in 11 years I had ignored a work message. The next morning I didn't go to the office. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. The company dashboards were still accessible remotely, and for the first time I wasn't opening them to fix anything. I was just observing. Like watching a machine continue running after the person who built it had stepped away. Everything looked fine at first. Campaign numbers were stable. Client reports were being generated automatically. To anyone inside the company, it probably looked like nothing had changed. But I knew better. There were tiny systems in place that most people never noticed. Temporary fixes I had written years ago. Automated scripts that cleaned up data errors. Background tasks that reset dashboards when they started lagging under heavy traffic. Small invisible things that kept the whole structure stable. And many of those things depended on me checking them regularly. Around noon my phone rang. Richard. I watched the screen light up with his name, and let it ring until it stopped. A minute later it rang again. Then again. Finally a message came through. Elena, where are you? We need you here. For 11 years those words had controlled my schedule, my weekends, and my sleep. But this time I simply locked my phone and took another sip of coffee. By the afternoon, the first crack appeared. One of the internal analytics dashboards froze during a client presentation. Normally I would have received 3 frantic calls within minutes, but this time no one knew exactly what to do. Someone rebooted the system. That temporarily fixed it, but the underlying issue was still there. Then another message came from Richard. Elena, call me immediately. I didn't. Instead I opened one of the dashboards remotely and watched the error logs grow slowly longer. Each line of code told the same story. Data queues were stacking up. Automated reports were running slower. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but it was the beginning. The next day things became more obvious. A major retail client called the office because their campaign performance report hadn't updated in 20 hours. That had never happened before. Richard tried calling me 4 times before sending an email. Elena, this is becoming unacceptable. We need you to respond. I smiled slightly at that word. Unacceptable. The same man who laughed when his daughter called me stupid now expected immediate loyalty. That afternoon another message appeared, this time from Lily. Elena, if you're upset about the meeting, you need to grow up and come back. We have real work to do. I stared at the message for a moment, then closed the email window. By the 3rd day, the company was officially in trouble. Without the background maintenance scripts I usually ran every morning, several systems began colliding with each other. Campaign data started duplicating itself. Reports were showing conflicting numbers. Client dashboards that normally refreshed every hour were now taking half a day. Inside the office, confusion spread quickly. Employees started blaming each other. Managers called emergency meetings. And Richard kept dialing my number. But the most interesting thing happened on day 4. A client called me directly. His name was Mark Jensen, a longtime partner whose company had been with Hale Digital for almost 7 years. I answered the call out of curiosity. Elena, he said immediately. I've been trying to reach someone at the office all morning. What's going on over there? I leaned back in my chair. What do you mean? Our performance reports are all over the place, he said. Yesterday they showed a 20% increase in traffic. Today they show a 12% drop. Your people can't explain it. I paused. Well, I said carefully. I'm not working there anymore. Silence filled the line. You're what? I left. Another long pause followed. That explains a lot, Mark muttered. That sentence stayed with me. Because Mark wasn't the only client who started asking questions. Over the next 2 days, 3 more clients contacted me directly. Some had my personal number from years of late-night troubleshooting. Others found me through LinkedIn. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Something at Hale Digital wasn't working anymore. And slowly, people began connecting the dots. Inside the company, panic was starting to replace arrogance. On the evening of the 6th day, Richard finally showed up at my apartment building. I heard the knock while I was cooking dinner. When I opened the door, he looked exhausted. Elena, he said quickly, stepping forward. We need to talk. I leaned against the doorframe calmly. About what? You know exactly what, he said, running a hand through his hair. The systems are failing. Clients are furious. Nobody understands how half of this stuff works. That sentence almost made me laugh. For 11 years, he had been proud that the company ran smoothly without needing to understand the details. Now those details were suddenly important. Sounds stressful, I said quietly. Elena, he said again, his voice tightening. I need you to come back tomorrow and fix this. Fix this. Just like always. But something was different now. I shook my head slowly. I can't. His expression hardened. Can't or won't. Both. For a moment we just stood there in silence. Finally he sighed heavily. Look, he said. Lily shouldn't have said what she said. She has a sharp tongue. Sharp tongue. The same excuse he had used for years. Then he added the sentence that proved nothing had really changed. But you have to understand, you embarrassed her in that meeting. I blinked slowly. Embarrassed her? Yes, he said. Correcting her in front of everyone made her look bad. For a second I thought he was joking. But he wasn't. That was the moment I realized something important. Richard Hale truly believed the problem wasn't the insult. The problem was that I had dared to speak. I stepped back slightly and folded my arms. You should probably go, I said calmly. Elena. You should go? I repeated. He stared at me for a long moment, frustration burning in his eyes. Then he turned and walked down the hallway without another word. When the elevator doors closed behind him, I finally allowed myself to smile. Because the collapse had only just begun. And the most satisfying part was still ahead. The moment when Lily and her father would finally realize something they had ignored for 11 years. The person they laughed at was the only reason their company had ever worked at all. And without that person, the entire empire was already starting to fall apart. The morning after Richard showed up at my apartment, I woke up to 17 missed calls. Not from him. From his employees. Project managers. Analysts. Even 2 people from the finance department who had barely spoken to me in years. I scrolled through the notifications slowly, realizing something important. When systems collapse inside a company, the people on the ground feel it first. They're the ones trying to answer clients, trying to fix numbers that don't make sense, trying to explain problems they don't understand. And when they can't fix it, they start searching for the person who can. By noon, the situation at Hale Digital had gotten worse. Much worse. I knew because I still had access to some of the external dashboards the clients used. They weren't company systems exactly. They were shared reporting tools I had originally designed to keep communication smooth. And now those dashboards were showing something I hadn't expected so soon. Clients were pausing campaigns. That's a quiet but dangerous signal in the marketing world. It means they don't trust the numbers anymore. And when trust disappears, contracts usually follow. My phone rang again. This time it was a number I recognized immediately. Lily. I let it ring. Then it rang again 5 minutes later. And again. Finally a message appeared. Elena, this isn't funny. You need to fix what you broke. I stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone back on the table. What I broke? That was interesting. Because the truth was I hadn't broken anything. I had simply stopped fixing it. Later that afternoon another call came through. This one I answered. It was Mark Jensen again. Elena, he said immediately, his voice tense. I just got off a call with Richard. Something's seriously wrong over there. I can imagine, I said calmly. They couldn't explain basic performance data, he continued. Their strategy team looked completely lost. I didn't respond. Then he said something that made me lean forward slightly. Off the record, are you starting your own firm? I paused. No. Because if you were, he said carefully, I'd move our contract in a heartbeat. That sentence stayed in the room long after the call ended. Because for the first time in 11 years, I realized something. My value had never actually been tied to Hale Digital. It had been tied to the knowledge I carried with me. That evening I opened my laptop and began organizing files I had kept privately over the years. Client strategy notes. System frameworks. Process outlines. None of it belonged to the company exactly, just my own professional records. But looking at them all together was like seeing 11 years of invisible work suddenly laid out in front of me. Meanwhile, across the city, Hale Digital was spiraling. I knew because someone from inside the company finally sent me a message that made the situation crystal clear. It was Jason, one of the senior analysts. Elena, they're blaming each other in meetings. Lily says the systems were poorly designed. Richard says the tech team should fix it. The tech team says they don't understand how half of it works. I smiled slightly when I read that. Of course they didn't. Those systems had evolved slowly over a decade, adjusted piece by piece through hundreds of small crises. Anyone trying to understand them overnight would feel like they were reading a language they'd never learned. Jason sent another message. Also, 3 clients canceled meetings today. That was the moment the real damage began. Because in business, problems inside the company are manageable. But problems that reach the clients? Those spread like fire. 2 days later, Richard called again. I almost ignored it. But curiosity got the better of me. When I answered, he didn't even say hello. Elena, we need to negotiate. Negotiate. That word alone told me everything had changed. I'm listening, I said. We'll increase your salary, he said quickly. 40%. For 11 years, every raise discussion had been a slow battle. Now he was throwing numbers out within seconds. And Lily? I asked calmly. There was a pause. She'll apologize, he said. I could practically hear his teeth grinding through the phone. And after that? I asked. What do you mean? After I fix everything, I said. What stops the same thing from happening again? Another silence. Because we both knew the answer. Nothing. Elena, he said finally, his voice tightening. You're being unreasonable. The company needs you. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. For years, hearing those words would have made me feel proud. Now they just sounded late. You needed me last week, I said quietly. Then I ended the call. The next few days were chaos for Hale Digital. Word had spread among clients that the internal systems were unstable. Campaign reports became inconsistent. 2 major accounts suspended contracts until the company could prove their data accuracy again. Inside the office, the atmosphere had completely changed. Jason kept sending updates. People are updating their resumes. Lily canceled 3 presentations. Richard hired external consultants to analyze the systems. That last message made me laugh out loud. Because I knew exactly what those consultants were seeing. Lines of code that depended on processes nobody understood. Data flows connected to scripts nobody could trace. A structure that looked simple on the surface but required years of context to truly manage. In other words, a system built by someone who had lived with it for 11 years. And that someone wasn't there anymore. 1 week later, I heard the final piece of news. Richard had called an emergency meeting with the entire company. Jason recorded part of it and sent me the transcript. Richard stood at the front of the room explaining that the company would be restructuring operations to stabilize their systems. Then Lily spoke. And this part almost felt poetic. According to Jason, she said, "We've realized we may have underestimated the complexity of some of our internal infrastructure." Underestimated. That was a polite way of saying they had no idea how things worked. But the most important moment came at the end of the meeting. Someone in the back asked a simple question. Why didn't we just bring Elena back? The room went silent. Jason said Richard looked down at the floor before answering. We tried. That single sentence carried 11 years of history. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't shouting, fighting, or destroying something. Sometimes it's simply stepping away and letting people discover the value they ignored. A month later, Hale Digital lost its largest client. 2 months later, half the strategy department had resigned. And as for me, I started consulting independently, not with revenge in mind, just with something I had never allowed myself before. Choice. But every now and then, when I think back to that conference room, to Lily's voice saying her dog was smarter than me, I can't help smiling. Because the real mistake that day wasn't her insult. It was the moment they laughed. The moment they believed the quiet woman in the corner had no power. When in reality, they had just unplugged the only person keeping their entire company alive.